Do you ever get really frustrated about something and just want to... Well, that's Matthew's gospel in a nutshell. Matthew was frustrated that the Jewish leaders and people hadn't recognized Jesus as the Messiah they'd been waiting for. He was so frustrated with them, a frustration that was spilling over into anger. So he wrote his gospel to make it as easy as possible to see Jesus as the fulfillment of what Israel had been waiting for all these years, the Messiah in the line of David. So how did he do that? And why is Matthew's gospel important for us today? Firstly, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophets. There are between 350 and 500 prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, and Matthew draws on loads of these in his Gospel. There's too many to mention, but here's just a few examples. Matthew starts with a full genealogy of Jesus, proving that he is from the messianic line of David, a son of Abraham. And then there's the story of Jesus' birth, and how the events prophesied in the Old Testament are fulfilled in him, born of a virgin in Bethlehem. In chapter 4, verses 12 to 17, Matthew quotes from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 2, to show that Jesus fulfills the prophecy of a great light shining in a land of darkness. When he describes the crucifixion and resurrection, Matthew draws on loads of different Old Testament prophecies, like Jesus being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver in Zechariah 11, verses 12 to 13, Jesus being mocked at the crucifixion from Psalm 22, and his resurrection in Psalm 16 verse 10. There's plenty of other examples, but you get the point. For Matthew, the fact that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies validates his identity as the Messiah, and how Jesus is the embodiment of God's promises to Israel and his whole world. Secondly, Jesus is the new Moses. There are many similarities between the life of Moses and how Matthew portrays Jesus. Matthew is the only gospel writer who has Jesus flee into Egypt, and so, like Moses, he comes out of Egypt to set his people free. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, which is mirrored in the 40 days that Jesus spent there. Moses received the commandments from God on Mount Sinai, and Jesus gives his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew tells the story of Jesus' transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah appear beside him. Moses prayed and God provided manna from heaven. Jesus feeds the 5,000. In the Old Testament, there are the 5 books of Moses, and Matthew arranges his gospel around Jesus giving 5 sets of teaching and sermons. For Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses. In fact, he's greater than Moses, because Moses set the people of Israel free, but Jesus will set free the whole of humanity. Now, this is really important for Matthew's purposes and for us today, because it shows continuity in God's plan for salvation. Moses had delivered the people of God from slavery in Egypt, and Jesus fulfills that at a deeper spiritual level by delivering the people of God from the slavery of sin. Moses had played a significant role in establishing a covenantal relationship between God and his people, and Jesus established a new covenant through the shedding of his blood on the cross. Spiritual deliverance worked out in a covenant relationship of love. That is at the very heart of the Christian experience. Thirdly, Jesus ushers in a new world order. Jesus comes to announce the kingdom of God, which is God's rescue plan for the whole world. He confronted evil and death and created a new family that would follow him and obey his teachings and live under his rule. Jesus formed a new movement, a new community built on new values. There are no privileged members. The poor are rich, the meek inherit, the persecuted are blessed. We're to love our enemies and bless those who curse us. This new community is an upside down kingdom. But Matthew stresses the fact that God's new world order would not be popular with everyone, because it was a challenge to existing power structures. The religious leaders had a very particular idea of what their Messiah would be like, coming in victory to deliver Israel from pagan oppressors. So they see Jesus as a false teacher, making blasphemous claims. In chapter 12, we see the anger of the Pharisees towards Jesus and their plot to kill him. But in chapter 13, Jesus gives the parable of the sower to show us that even though not everyone will accept God's kingdom, its spread will not be stopped by opposition. And then in chapter 16, Jesus withdraws with his disciples and asks them who they think he is. Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." But even he misunderstands the truth, and Jesus has to explain how he must suffer and die for the sins of his people. This is an allusion, of course, to Isaiah 53, so Matthew is again portraying Jesus as the suffering servant, the Jewish Messiah. And eventually the two kingdoms clash on Palm Sunday. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the crowds hail him as the Messiah. Jesus goes to the temple and cleanses it. The authorities keep questioning Jesus, trying to trap him, and eventually they decide to have him killed, resulting in the crucifixion. But Matthew concludes his gospel in chapter 28 with Jesus' final teaching, the Great Commission. Jesus is the true King of the world, who sends his disciples out with the good news that Jesus is Lord, and that anyone can join this new spiritual family by being baptized and by following Jesus' commandments. And Matthew's final words of Jesus are this: "I am with you always to the end of the age," which takes us right back to where we began, because in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, Jesus is prophesied as Emmanuel, and Emmanuel means God with us. So for Matthew, Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfilment of Judaism, the hope of Israel and the hope of the world. We need Matthew's gospel to show us Jesus' true identity, to show us the eternal continuity of God's plan for our salvation, to reassure us about the unbreakable promises of God and the eternal covenant of love that exists between us and God. And in the light of that, like those first believers, we too are sent out into the world to proclaim God's love and to make disciples. As then, so it is now. Jesus' final words: "I am with you always to the end of the age."